Hi folks, this is Mr. MegaManFan. Like, share, comment, and survive, because that's what we're going to try to do today in Montezuma's Revenge. This NES game is hidden under a tangle of cords and cables, but it's plugged into a top-loading NES that I've had modified, and it's running on my HD television 4K through the RetroTink. So I'm going to play this game and talk a little bit about its history, starting with the fact the original game was made for Atari 8-bit computers by Robert Jager with a concept by Mark Sunshine, who suggested to Robert that he make a game based on Mesoamerican culture, and that's exactly what he did. And he was only 16 years old at the time, so he couldn't even legally sell the rights to the game to Parker Brothers. His dad had to negotiate the contract for him. Now, when I was growing up, I didn't know this as an Atari 8-bit game. I knew it as an Apple II game because we would play it in the computer lab at school, and we were rather devious about it because those computers were supposed to be for educational purposes, but if you opened up the hood of the Apple II, kind of like popping the front hood on a car, you would just lift it up, and inside there was one specific wire that connected to the sound, and if you disconnected that wire from the board, no sound would come out of the computer. So we could get away with playing Montezuma's Revenge on what was supposed to be classroom time. As long as the teacher didn't come over and look at your monitor, you could get away with it. And if they did start coming your way, you'd just have to quickly turn the computer off and on so that you weren't currently playing the game. You couldn't just turn off the monitor because then they could just turn it on and see what you were doing. Now, after hours at school, you could pretty much get away with anything you wanted because it was no longer during class time. So, needless to say, we played a lot of this game, and I played it to the point that I knew just from hearing the sounds of people who hadn't disconnected it, what room they were in at the time, just by the patterns of the doors they would hit and how far apart the sounds were and the items they would pick up going through each room. I knew it by sound. You could blindfold me at that age and I could tell where somebody was in the game. That memory is now long gone to me because I haven't played this for years, but this adaptation of it feels remarkably faithful to that experience, so it may start coming back to me. What wasn't coming back to me was the timing of how to jump over the enemies. Now, you can pick up swords to take enemies out, but they're one-time use only. So there are some rooms where you actually need the sword to get past an enemy to get an item, so you don't want to waste it on an enemy you don't need to kill by jumping over. This game forces you to think strategically, which I think was a very good thing for me at that age, because it taught me patience and planning and how to solve puzzles. They're all single-room puzzles, but they're all platforming puzzles as well, so it combined two of the things that I loved the most: platforming and adventure. This game has plenty of both. Now, I think to say it's Mesoamerican is a little bit of a stretch. In fact, most people, if they heard the term Montezuma's Revenge, they would think of gastrointestinal distress because, unfortunately, that is what most people in popular culture would associate Montezuma with. So let's not really say this is either that or Mesoamerican in any respect, because it's really not. It's just a theme slapped onto a puzzle platforming game. But it's a fun game, and it's nice to see it get ported to Nintendo because up until a year ago, this didn't exist. Now, it's been ported to a whole lot of things over the years. I already mentioned Atari 8-bit computers and Apple IIs. Well, it was on Commodore. It was on Sega Master System, which I have a complete in-box copy of. It got to a lot of places in a lot of different ways. And even the Atari 2600 has a port of Montezuma's Revenge, although you wouldn't think it could run something this advanced. It does. Obviously not at this level of fidelity, but it still does. This version was made by Rob from Normal Distribution in Marlboro, New Jersey, and as far as I know, it's the one and only project Rob has ever launched on Kickstarter. And it was very successfully funded, getting well over 100% of its goal, and I backed it for $31, which was, I believe, $25 for the cost of the NES cartridge and $6 per shipping. I didn't want any of the fancy editions with a box and all the other stuff. I just wanted a cartridge of the game to see how it would compare to my childhood memories and experiences of Montezuma's Revenge, because I hadn't played it for a long time. Even the Sega Master System version that I have complete in box, I hadn't touched for a while. And I thought, why not just get a loose cartridge of this NES port and see how it stacks up, and then maybe go back and play the other versions of it later on. I even have an Apple IIc that I could play the old Apple II version on if I had a disc of it, which I don't. So what I really need is some sort of adapter that could mimic the Apple IIc disk drive and plug it into the back of the Apple and then get an image file and put it on an SD card. But that's getting way ahead of myself. I don't even know if such a thing exists, but I would sure like to find out and relive those old Apple II memories and see how it compares. Anyway, this version is really good, but if you've never played Montezuma's Revenge before, there's a few things you need to know, which you're probably picking up by watching this footage. For example, he's not Mario. Your hero can take fall damage. He can't go the entire length of a screen and land on his feet and not die. Therefore, your jumps have to be a little more precise than you might be used to. You might think if you land one square down from where you intended to jump, you'd be fine, and that could be just enough fall damage to kill you. You might think if you miss disappearing platforms and fall a little way beneath them, you'd be fine, but no, that can kill you. So you have to watch the timing of things. If the platforms are appearing and disappearing and you need to jump in rapid succession, wait until they're about to come back on again and start jumping before they do, so you make it all the way through them and then you survive. Otherwise, you could take fall damage when they disappear underneath your feet. Now, this is one reason that I like having a wireless 8BitDo controller to play this with, because then you can rapid fire the jump with the top two buttons, and that makes those parts a little bit easier. But you still have tricky platforming, and you still have annoying enemies, like this bat that appears if you take too long to clear a screen, and then he just carries you off the screen and you die. So even though you need to think about the way to solve some of these screens, you can't think about it for too long, because it's like the hall monster in Venture on ColecoVision. If you stay too long, it's gonna get you. This is great. I have no complaints about either the Kickstarter project or this version for Nintendo. It's kind of a shame that it didn't actually come out on Nintendo back in the day, although I can certainly understand with the onerous licensing restrictions that Nintendo had and the cuts of every sale that they took, and the fact that you had to order like 10,000 cartridges minimum, I think. Maybe even more than that, could be 10 times as much as that. There were high impediments to getting a game on the NES, unless you went the completely bootleg route like Color Dreams / Wisdom Tree, where you ignored the fact you needed a lockout chip and bypassed it with your own circumvention techniques. And then, of course, you had to get it into stores, and a lot of stores weren't going to take bootleg Nintendo games because they didn't want to face the wrath of Nintendo, who would threaten retailers to not send any of the popular games like Mario or Zelda to their stores, and they'd be left without inventory for their customers, which was a pretty effective threat. In fact, that's essentially why Color Dreams became Wisdom Tree, because they decided to reskin all their games as Christian Bible-themed games, because they thought, oh, Nintendo is not going to threaten Christian bookstores and Christian retailers, because that would look really bad, a Japanese company threatening little mom-and-pop religious stores. And they were right, it worked. So they got away with it, and there are plenty of bootleg NES games because a lot of other people got away with it. They couldn't really stop everybody, but they could stop some retailers from carrying these games. Anyway, I got off on a tangent there. That wasn't my point. My point was the licensing requirements were so draconian that some games that might have seen success on NES never came out on NES. And even major developers like Konami had to work around the restrictions of Nintendo. Like, they created a subsidiary called Ultra Games, which was for all intents and purposes Konami under a different name, because Nintendo limited you to 5 NES games that they would physically manufacture and publish for you. And Ultra Games was Konami's way to get more games out in 1 year than 5. So, who would have even published Montezuma's Revenge for NES back in the day? Probably not Parker Brothers. Who knows who it would have been? Who knows what subsidiary it would have been? Who knows if it would have sold enough copies to be profitable back then? But these are concerns that a modern-day homebrew port of Montezuma's Revenge doesn't have to worry about. All they have to do is make sure that everything is well programmed and runs, and obviously you can't patch a cartridge, so there had to be a sufficient amount of demo playtesting and bug fixing long before these cartridges were assembled and shipped out to the Kickstarter backers. But I'm not finding any bugs or glitches in my playthrough, so I'm perfectly satisfied with that. And as long as Felipe Renaud, the programmer of this version for NES, was working with Robert Jager and Mark Sunshine, which I assume he was based on the fact they are credited by name in the opening screen, then all of the intellectual property rights are taken care of. And the fact this was funded successfully on Kickstarter probably means they didn't see any issues with it either. So everybody got their cut, as they should. And I'm going to suggest that to you as well. Like, if you see this ROM out there, it's probably been dumped by somebody at this point, and I understand that. But also, if you see this and you like it, or you try the ROM and you like it, maybe get the official NES ROM from the official source. Like, get it on Steam if it's available in the digital storefront there, pay for it so everybody involved gets a cut. Or if Felipe has more cartridges left over from the Kickstarter backers, buy one directly from him and then everybody gets their cut. Like, support these homebrew efforts, because if you don't support the developers and programmers, then we never get new homebrew projects on Nintendo or any other old console. And that's going to be very challenging going forward, because the number of people who play retro games on retro consoles will shrink just inevitably. People will age out of it. People will sell off their collections. People will have hardware that stops working, and they're not going to buy homebrews for it because they're not going to repair it. So it's a small audience to begin with, and if you don't financially support the creators, then they're not going to have the incentive to create more things. So if you love it and enjoy it, and you're passionate about retro gaming and playing homebrew games on retro consoles, you have to go out there and support these developers. Give them your hard-earned money. And $25 was really not a big ask for something like this, especially a game that I had such fond memories of playing as a kid. I'm Mr. MegaManFan. I heartily endorse Montezuma's Revenge on Nintendo. This is a great version of it. I'm having fun relearning all of these puzzles and exploring all of these areas again. It's a really good time for me, and I think if you like puzzle platforming, it'll be a good time for you as well. Thanks for watching, happy holidays, and take care.